Hey, listeners, welcome to the podcast, and people who are reviewing, welcome to the Young Justice video broadcast. Today we're going to be talking about a harm reduction approach to addiction called safe injection sites. That's one of a few different terms we have for them. My guest today is State's Attorney Sarah George. She has been, maybe I could say, boosterish about this harm reduction approach. First of all, Sarah, thanks for being on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell me just a little bit, because I find that embarrassingly I had to look up what the state's attorney even did. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about what you do, how you got there, and then we can get into this.
Yeah. You're not alone,
Okay.
first of all. It's amazing how even people in the criminal justice system sometimes aren't entirely sure. But so the state's attorney's office is within the state of Vermont is broken down into counties. Each county has an elected state's attorney and then deputy state's attorneys underneath them. I have been a deputy state's attorney in Chittenden County since passing the bar exam back in 2010 under TJ Donovan. And then in January of this year, when TJ Donovan won the election for Attorney General in November and was sworn in January, Governor Scott appointed me to become the Chittenden County State's Attorney until the election in 2018.
No, wait, is this typical for a Republican governor? For Vermonters, we'll know this, but for people who aren't from Vermont, which there are a majority now listening, is this typical for a Republican governor to appoint a Democratic state's attorney?
I don't know how often the appointment process happens because it requires a sitting state's attorney to leave early. But I do believe that it is tradition for the governor to appoint a new state's attorney from the party that the voters elected.
Oh, I see. Okay.
He didn't have to. He could have picked a Republican to take over the office, but it's somewhat of a disrespect to the voters who voted in a Democrat because they're just finishing that term. But I don't know that it's happened enough to know whether it's common, but I certainly appreciated that he did. It certainly benefited me. But the state's attorney's office is the office that prosecutes the crimes. So law enforcement officers arrest people, they cite people, they send the paperwork to our office. We decide whether or not to charge it, what to charge them with, and then we arraign them in court and we represent the state against that person. We don't represent the victims. Although most of the time we're on the same page on that, but you know, in cases where a victim might not want to go forward, we still go forward with it because we represent the state. So if you know, on Law and Order, we're the district attorneys that are prosecuting on the other side of a defense attorney.
I can handle that. I can get my information on Law and Order.
Exactly.
So how did you were appointed in January
Yep.
of 2017 this year.
That's right.
And it wasn't too long after you were appointed that you made a statement that you would like to at least have a conversation about the idea of, I don't know if there were anything else, but what really made news was safe injection sites.
Yep.
Which, if you just read the comments in those sections, there are a lot of pushback against it. You're telling me maybe not so much, but how did you get interested in that idea, and what's your kind of factual basis for?
So when I became the state's attorney, I met with a lot of people right off to kind of figure out what people wanted to see from this office, what they wanted to see from me. And what became clear to me, I've never been in politics before, and this is now a political position. And I felt like there was a lot of talking about wanting to do something about different things and not always a lot of doing. And especially when it's a controversial topic. And from somebody who isn't, you know, this position isn't a stepping stone for me. This isn't something I've been dreaming of doing my whole life. It just, the timing worked out really well for me and I thought I could do a good job. But so controversial issues, they don't bother me.
Gotcha.
If anything, I want to have those conversations that nobody else wants to have, because at the end of the day, if it loses me votes, but it gets the public informed, I'm comfortable with that.
So it's not an urgency looking forward to like a political career if you make the wrong move?
Absolutely not.
Move in the eye of the voter, okay.
Yeah, it's not. It was something that multiple people had mentioned to me as being a bill that was currently in the legislature. I had a couple of people ask me what I thought about it, and then it was actually a deputy in my office who mentioned it to me again and said that she thought that I should really look into it. And so I did a little bit of research on my own and thought that made sense.
What did you find that you thought made sense or looked good to you?
What made me want to do it was that when people were asking me about it, I had no idea what it was. I've never heard of it before. And when I heard a little bit about it, I got uncomfortable with it. I thought, I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal, but this to me seems like too much. This seems a little bit into this area that I wasn't sure we should be going. And then I did first 5 minutes, 10 minutes of research, read a couple of articles on it, read some medical journals on it, and was pretty convinced that that was not the case, that all of the kind of immediate concerns I had in my head or the immediate kind of visceral reactions I had were unfounded in data, and that these consumption sites were really showing to save people's lives, which was enough for me. But I figured if my opinion on that could be changed so quickly that it made sense to have this be a very public conversation.
Sure, and you and I probably both are like a little higher in openness to change than some people might be. So what does it look like moving forward? You didn't just make the statement, you just said that you were done with just people being rhetorical, you wanted to make change. So where did you go from there?
Right, so I formed this commission. It started at about 8 people, and it's now about 12 to 15 people, depending on the week, because we'll have a conversation one week that happens in that next meeting, so they'll bring somebody in with them that can answer all of the questions that we couldn't answer previously. And so it's actually been expanded a lot, which is great. And the people on the commission are working on a report which will outline all of the pros, all of the cons, as much as we can, the potential financial costs or savings associated with it. A survey from known users in the community about whether or not they would use it and where they're currently using instead, how far they would travel to use one, things like that. And they're going to put that all together. They're writing that for me. They're going to put it together and present it to me, hopefully in September, hopefully by the end of September, so that in October I can have a follow-up press conference with my decision going into the legislative session, so that if I decide to support them, which I imagine I will, I can really go to bat for it in the legislature when they reconvene.
When you talk about this list of pros and cons that you're kind of conjuring, or the group is, what are the cons to this? Well, one person I talked to was Maya Salavis. She's an author. She wrote the book called Unbroken Brain. You're welcome, Maya. And one thing she asked is, like, at a time when death rates are skyrocketing, and we know that there are safe injection sites in 10 different countries, mostly in Europe, and then Australia and Canada, 66 different cities. Nobody's died in these facilities, and all the data shows a positive trend toward, social health issues. So she's asking me a rhetorical question, like, what would be the argument?
Yeah. Well, so when I say cons, it's the perceived cons.
Okay.
To be clear, yeah, it's I want the report to say, is there a risk of people driving from this facility under the influence? Because that's something that people are concerned about. Is this going to cost the taxpayers a lot of money? Because that's something that people keep bringing up. Like, not my tax money is going, will this increase crime around the facility? It's those types of things. Those are the only cons that I know of. Or actually another one is, will people travel to Chittenden County to use this from other places, or move here just for that, or does this enable drug use? Those types, like the just common, in my opinion, misconceptions, but what people immediately think of as cons, those will be in there and addressed
so that you can address them.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
I got you.
Which end up being, I think, will end up being proven wrong.
Could we run just a thought experiment? We don't have to go down the list or anything, but just like, I imagine the people who are worried I forget how exactly you phrased it, but this sort of condoning use. Is crime going to be higher around these facilities? Are people going to be driving away from the facilities? And then we're like condoning it, and we put this into law. So what is an argument against that, in your opinion, or your findings so far?
Well, one, I think the condoning it, that's something that I had thought too. You know, I mean, that I understand that as a theory, but the research has just shown that that is not true. The people that, if anything, the individuals who will use a safe consumption site are already using. They're not now breaking the law or going out of their way to break the law. They're already doing it. And so I think you're enabling good, safer practice of drug use, not drug use in general, because the entire target that you're working with are already using. And frankly, I think the primary goal of a safe consumption site is that you have people coming in to use and leaving with literature or resources, or best case scenario, medically assisted treatment, if that's something that they want. If you have a doctor on site that will prescribe, if that's something they want, or residential treatment, or, so if anything, the enabling is of getting clean and getting sober and having the resources that a lot of people don't have access to right now.
Of course, I'm playing devil's advocate.
Right.
You know that, but anyone listening, that's what I'm doing. But my argument against it has been, I've had this conversation a lot. It's like we're kind of playing a semantic game there when we say enable or condone, because you could also say we acknowledge that there are a subset of people who are using regularly and who would benefit from making contact and doing so in a way that is like they're allowed to be human beings in this facility and moving from there in the positive trajectory.
Right.
And all the data really does show that. There's no really need to have a hypothetical conversation, except that we just don't have one here in the U.S. yet. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and as to the driving away, at Safe Recovery right now, where they do the needle exchange in Burlington, they, on more than one occasion, have had individuals who have come in high and then gone to leave, and the staff there have said, you cannot drive, and if you do, I will call the cops. You are under the influence and you cannot drive. And they don't. They stay, and they let their high wear off, and then they leave. And I think that it's really that simple. You have all of them that I've seen that are in place require a 30 to 45 minute cool down, I think they call it, after, where you have to stay, you cannot leave the facility, and if you do, the cops are called. Especially, I believe that's only if you're driving, if they know that you've driven there. But regardless, there are ways to combat that. And again, these are people that have gone out of their way to come to a safe place to use. They don't want to get out there, get back outside and drive.
Yeah, I think it's a red herring. But I think
Agreed.
if you're going to bring it up, then it's worth saying that the trends from all the numbers from all the data show that any of these concerns are made much less.
Right.
There are no public health concerns or like no rise in deaths from any of these types of things, including driving.
Right.
So if you're going to look at it, it's like it's interesting that you would have that sort of reaction when you could think about these people. If you have to wait 30 or 45 minutes, I'm guessing that because the inability to temper impulses is so directly almost linked with addiction in general, you might think the 30 to 45 minutes is actually much more likely to save a life with respect to somebody making a choice after they're administered a drug.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that.
So as far as the taxpayers are concerned, I figured this would be, from a politician's standpoint, or from somebody trying to inspire a law or a piece of legislation, that must be a tough bit to sell, because there are going to be people who say, whether they agree with it or not, or whether they know about it or not, a lot of people will say, slow down. If you're going to spend my money, show me that this is going to work, or I don't want to spend my money on something like this. So how have you thought about ways to coincide with people with those kinds of opinions?
Well, first, I mean, I don't know that it will cost the taxpayers any money. I think that UVM Medical Center is extremely supportive of the idea of safe consumption sites.
UVM Medical Center, for people who don't know, is the hospital in Burlington.
Right, right. And, obviously they have not agreed to anything of this nature, but I would imagine that they would provide a nurse or medical staff for the facility. And my ideal would be to put the facility within a facility that already exists. It would not be building a new facility just for this, which may then create tax money being involved. But take Safe Recovery, for example. Their facility already exists. They already have staff. They're already giving out the needle exchange. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a place where you just put some medical staff in and you build some, some booths basically for people to use. Or Phoenix Labs is a new lab in Burlington that has additional space within their lab, putting something in there that's already existing. What I think people don't realize is how much tax money there's already spending for infections and blood infections and hospitalizations for individuals who are overdosing, or the thousands and thousands of dollars being spent by police resources and EMTs to deliver Narcan and respond to scenes of overdoses and fatalities. That's where there's a potential that this could save a lot of tax dollars. I'm hoping the report will go into that a little bit more, because I asked UVM Medical Center to try to find out statistics of how much money is being spent every year in blood infections and site infections. And I've asked BPD if they have any ballpark of how much the police are responding. I mean, I know the numbers of how much they're responding, but in terms of actually, we wouldn't need to be spending all that money sending police to the overdoses if they're all happening with a medical professional there. So
that's true. And I talked to a woman named Sally Sattel. She actually runs a methadone clinic in Washington, D.C. She's part of the American Enterprise Institute, and she's a lecturer at Yale University. So I was asking her about this because, in terms of somebody who is on our side, I guess I don't know exactly what your side is, but who's on my side on this issue, you don't get much more conservative than her. Like, you got to work pretty hard to find someone as conservative who agrees with me so much. So I asked her, will you play devil's advocate here? Will you, what is it going to look like for conservative voters, and how do you need to convince them? She said two things about it. One, she said, one way to frame it is that it's not really even a matter of should we do this. It's a matter of we're going to do this, and once we do, what is the most both cost-effective and just overall effective way to save people's lives and save money. So that's one thing she said. And the other is that she was talking about, in order to get taxpayer buy-in, she has an idea that, if you go to a town meeting, for instance, it's worth examining, are there things that people can do when they enter this facility to give back to the community, whether it's like a tacit expectation or a mandate. What do you think about that? Has that been discussed at all?
It hasn't. I don't know how I feel about that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's like asking an individual who goes to the hospital for treatment that they, in order to get services there, they need to do community service after they're treated. I understand it in theory, and I could buy into it a little bit, but I think that's just one more deterrent that could potentially keep people from using it.
If there was a mandate.
Right.
But if there was, how about, have you discussed there being like an offer to branch out into the community for kind of social supports or anything like that?
We haven't. I mean, the offers, that is certainly something that's doable, especially, I do think that any of these facilities should have ample resources available to that person. Mm-hmm. And, I would love to have follow-up conversations with anybody who uses it about whether or not it worked for them, or whether or not they eventually were clean and how they did that. I think that would be a great follow-up conversation. But I don't know how many people would do that.
So one thing that I've been hearing a lot is that if we're going to do this, we need to make sure that we combine this with accessibility of treatment. So what do people mean when they say treatment? That could mean a variety of things. And as far as I'm concerned, that means things within the medical and also just within like a social and psychological base of living a decent life. So what does that mean when we say that?
I mean, I've certainly said that, and what I've meant by it is, so if, for example, in Vancouver, I think
Insight.
one of the biggest sites that we have, or that certainly North America has, it's like a 3-story facility. It's enormous, and my understanding is that the first floor has the safe consumption site on it, and then the second floor is there's doctors prescribing methadone or Suboxone, and the third floor is a residential treatment program. So you can go into the first floor and you can just use and you can leave, or you can talk to somebody about getting a prescription, or you can talk to somebody about going into residential. And I think they claim in some ways that the reason that works so well for them is that people are coming in, they're getting them when they might not otherwise even have access to that person, and they're able to, not convince, I don't mean that in a bad way, but convince them maybe you should go upstairs and talk to a doctor, or maybe you should think about residential treatment.
Yeah. And also, to your point, from what I understand, not that much convincing or cajoling has to happen.
Exactly.
People tend to just do it.
Exactly. I think that is where Vermont is struggling right now, that Emmett in our rapid intervention program will have people come in that say, I want to go to residential treatment. And he's like, well, it's a 3-week wait list, so we can put your name on the list and I'll let you know, and that 3 weeks is life or death for a lot of those individuals. And if they can't get it that day when they're focused on that and not using, it can sometimes be a day too late. So I think that if we really want to make all of this work, the best case scenario would be to have a site, but also have on-demand prescriptions for Suboxone or methadone or residential treatment.
I noticed that you didn't say, let me give you an opinion actually before I go into that. I noticed you didn't say Vivitrol or naltrexone, which maybe that's just something you omitted and that was not planned. But here's something that I was thinking about, and you can tell me if you agree with this or not. This might be where we split ways, I don't know. But in the long term, like Stanton Peele, a man who I interviewed recently, a really smart psychologist, and he's a lawyer actually, from Brooklyn. He's written like 12 books on this. I'm writing a book with him right now, and tacitly, it's not really the thesis of the book, we're arguing against a chronic brain disease theory of addiction, like an ultra medicalized theory of addiction. And we're not arguing it for, like, people will push back and say, oh, how can you say that, addiction is a choice? And actually, we're not saying that either. We're saying that people live based on values, choices, and that's what addiction is. Sometimes you do things that go against your own values, but it's not because you are, like, chronically ill. So if you look at some data, I promise I won't make this too long, but so 80 to 90% of people, if you look at NIDA or the National Institute of Health or any salient data collection, 80 to 90% of people who do drugs, including heroin, don't become addicted to them. They don't end up having long-term psychological or social problems. Of those people, there's a survey called the National Epidemiological Survey of Alcoholism and Related Conditions. It's been done twice, and it's like a sample size of 43,000 people. Really good data that show that about 80% of those people tend to walk away from addictions on their own without treatment. So that's interesting because it leaves us with, to be generous, I'll say like between 5 to 8% of people who tend to be really long-term users, which means that a lot of the people who are dying of drug overdoses, and they tend to be mixed drug overdoses or drugs that are tampered with by fentanyl or carfentanil, those people they either aren't addicted at the time, or probably if they could stay alive long enough would move away from addiction without treatment. So this is sort of, to your point, saying that if there's a place that people can go and ensure that they're going to live long enough, they are likely, stats show, they're likely to survive and be productive parts of society. I like what you're saying, and maybe your coalition's saying, maybe just being a spokesperson for the coalition, about being able to give methadone or Suboxone. So NCBI data shows that has the potential to cut death rate about 50% or more. So that's, hard to argue. You got to work pretty hard to tell me why you don't want to cut death rate 50%. Now, when it comes to naltrexone and Vivitrol, this is something that Stanton and I were talking about recently, but it didn't make it on the show. I think that it should be, I don't know what he thinks actually, I think it should be offered to people. But, and I don't know how much you know about it or think about it, but it's, an opiate blocker.
Right.
And from what I've seen, it has no really good effect, largely better than a placebo. And actually, it tends to obfuscate the importance of making other life choices. And, you're kind of just getting off the drug. And that could be good, but if you're not doing anything else in your life to help you move away from an addicted state, you now have no tolerance. So that's one thing about methadone. You gain a consistent dose. So you have a tolerance. Even if you do drugs on top of it, you're not as likely to overdose. But something like naltrexone and Vivitrol, data's fuzzy right now, but I have a guess that a lot of people might go back to using drugs, try to use as they always did, and they might be more likely to overdose. Which all comes back to it would be a good idea to have a safe injection site where all this stuff happens.
Yeah.
So I guess my question, based on that mouthful, is that what do you think about do we need to get super nuanced about the way we talk about treatment? Do you think it could spell either success or maybe detriment for this program? Because I would hate to see it open and then, somehow there's not success, whatever that measure is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that treatment in general is different for everybody. I don't, I've really only started looking into this as much as I have since maybe February. So I certainly don't claim to be an expert on any of this. Most of what I know is either through this commission, talking with, doctors at UVM Medical Center about it, or other people at Safe Recovery and Vermont Cares, but also what I see in court and the defendants that we're working with. Or, the state's attorney's office is required to go to every untimely death in the county. And so whether that's an older person who dies from, natural causes, or, in my most recent case, 24-year-old girl who dies from an overdose. But aside from those, which I think are actually most often a different circumstance, the individuals that I'm working with in court, there are times when I have tried, I have one particular male in mind who I tried to get him to go to treatment over and over and over and over again, and finally got him into the clinic, and I thought that was going really well, and he was on Suboxone, and then he committed a bunch more crimes, and so I ultimately fought really hard to keep him in jail, and he was very upset with me and screaming at me and crying, and was really afraid of detoxing in jail. And I saw him a month later, and he looked the best I'd seen him in the 7 years I've been prosecuting him, and he's about my age. He's we're not a whole lot different.
I won't.
Yeah,
you don't need to ask how
yeah.
old,
I'm 34, and this was a couple of years ago now, and he was the same age as me, and he came over to me at one point and told me that I'd saved his life because he detoxed in jail to nothing. And my concern at the time was when he gets out, if he uses again, he's at a much higher risk of overdosing. But luckily in his case, he was able to get back on, or to get into recovery treatment right out of jail, which I think is a whole nother issue.
It's another conversation.
Yeah,
it's hard to even bring up.
Yeah, that we just don't have enough of focus on that either, that we can get people clean, but keeping them sober is very difficult sometimes. But anyway, for him, that's what he needed, and that's what worked. There's other people that have failed out of Valley Vista or Brattleboro Retreat, or over and over and over and over again. And then on the 8th,
what do you mean when you say failed out?
Like they get kicked out for using, or they just leave on their own. They don't want to finish. And then on the 8th try, it works, and they stay, and they're clean. And I really don't know enough about Vivitrol and what is the other one?
Naltrexone.
Yeah, naltrexone. I don't know a lot. All I have heard is the same concerns that you have said, which is why I never mention them, because I don't know enough about them, and anything I've heard I haven't been thrilled with. So I've heard from people that don't like Suboxone and they prefer methadone, or vice versa. Suboxone, I had a defendant in court this morning who said that Suboxone made her crave more, and so she only takes methadone. I think everybody's different, and we just need to be aware of that and give people what they need to be successful.
Yeah, I agree. And so what I appreciate about what you're doing is, like, I think that when we view addiction as a moral failing, I think we're largely moving away from that.
Yeah.
But when we do, I say largely, I'm talking about in Vermont. I don't think we're largely moving
Right.
away from that in the U.S.
Yeah.
Because when we do that, it just sets people up to fail. And it doesn't do any good for, even if you just don't care about people and have no empathy, it doesn't do
Yeah.
any good for society at large unless you run a private prison maybe. But it also, if you think about addiction as this disease that you'll never get over, the best you can do is get to your baseline of whatever success means to you. That I don't think that does any good either. And what I like about the way what you've brought up here is that I think you're noticing we've tried both of those things. There are a variety of treatment facilities. There are a variety of ways people could be arrested, and we can stick to, like, if you commit a crime other than drug use, if you steal a car, you're not going to say, we don't have to get so ultra liberal that we say, oh, it was the drugs. But what you've done here is you've brought up a point that our first and foremost focus should be saving lives.
Right.
So we need to care that people are dying.
Yeah.
And one way to do this is to open up harm reduction facilities like we did with needle exchanges and things like that.
Yep.
And so I like the way you're looking at literature rather than trying to appeal only to anecdotes, because there are only so many of those.
Yeah, and I've gotten a hard time about my opinion on the. I don't buy into the addiction as a disease, at least the way it's portrayed, and I don't mean any disrespect to addiction by that. I just think that, the common person, I think, would say to that, and I know has said to that, cancer is a disease, like, not opiate addiction. It is a choice, or like you were talking about before, which I don't necessarily agree with that either. But I think that there is, you could never make a choice, a negative choice for a harmful consequence in your life, and you might still get cancer. And I think that opiate addiction does stem from choices that you make, whether or not that means, using a friend of yours extra pills after they have a surgery and getting addicted to pills, and then going to heroin, which I think is, from my experience anyway, the most often how people are getting addicted. But you also, and I again don't mean any disrespect by this, it's probably the hardest thing that anybody can do, but you can choose to not be addicted.
Yes.
You can choose to stop that by getting into treatment or doing what you need to do, when you don't always have that choice with a disease, a brain disease, or
the way I argue it is
heart
that
disease.
I mean, choice is not all or nothing. People could be more or less free to choose than other people.
Right.
Like, if you look at who gets addicted, one of the criteria for statistically, if you're likely to be addicted, if you make $20,000 a year or less, you're 3 times more likely to become addicted than someone who makes $50,000 or more a year. So, I mean, those people making $20,000 a year or less trying to feed their family don't have tons of choices, maybe, about how to live a flourishing life. But you'll have more choices if you have a place to go where people treat you humanely, and you have things to think about, and literature and all the things I think that you're mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody doesn't need a dime to go into a safe consumption site and use, and also talk to somebody who isn't going to judge them, or can give them, and not only can give them some literature about potential resources, but call those people for them. Sometimes it's making the phone call is the hardest thing for them to do, but if they have somebody else that will do that for them, that could literally be, that could save their life.
I forget who it was. It might have been Maya, who I was talking about earlier, said that she gave a talk, and so to do this talk, she's a journalist, neuroscience journalist. She went around to all different kind of harm reduction facilities, and I think this is a needle exchange that she went to, and she was interviewing people there. And if it's not Maya, sorry, then whoever it is, I'll give credit later. She's interviewing people there, and she said, "What is appealing about this?" And she said, "It's like I talked to someone, and it's a simple act of giving me something that's clean, and a message that says, I care whether you die or not. I care about you as a person." And like that can jumpstart a whole new array of choices to be made that are more in line with people's values, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and I deal with people all the time in the criminal justice system where I often think I care more about them than they do. I'm often arguing on their behalf to get them treatment when they don't want it. And that's a really tough struggle for me, because I don't think you can conquer it until you want to. But I think sometimes people need a little bit of a kick to get there. And sometimes that means if you don't do this, you're going to go to jail. And that's just not something I like having to do. But when you continue to commit crime in order to feed your habit, at some point, there's a lot of addicts out there that are not doing that. They're figuring it out some other way, probably don't want to know necessarily, but, there has to be at some point for some of these people, a wall where it says, no, you can't keep doing this or you're gonna die. And they either do or they don't. And unfortunately, in the 7 years I've been in this office, a lot of them have died. I can't even count how many defendants have died from overdoses when, a week earlier I was begging them to get into treatment and they said they didn't need it, or they said they didn't want it. And I know that's not my fault, but it's still my job. And that's why I went into this. I was like, I've seen too many young, dead people that I feel like we could have done more for.
That's something I appreciate. Alex is in the control room, and he's being polite, but I know we're running out of time. I want to say that's something I really appreciate about the whole thing and everything I've read about you and your statements is that unlike some people who just like to make noise on social media or wherever, who say, oh my God, we have a crisis, it's a crisis and the sky is falling and nothing we can do about it, is almost the message you get. I hear you saying that you were involved in the criminal justice system, and whether your position directly should or shouldn't or is usually involved with trying to drive a policy around drug law or drug crime or drug death. You're saying you've seen too many salient, emotionally disturbing things around you not to do anything, and you're taking steps to do it. Yeah. I want to ask, how likely do you think this is going to be to go forward? Do you think that this is something that we can see a safe injection site in Vermont sometime soon?
I really don't know. I think that having conversations like this with people in the community to really understand them is going to help. I think making it a normal conversation instead of a scary, down to the fact that I call it a safe consumption site instead of safe injection. And I think that that's something that in your mind sounds better. It doesn't sound as visceral and scary to people that you imagine people just going in and injecting heroin into their veins. Consumption just sounds better. But having that conversation with as many people as I can, to, even if the conversation is, you should really do some research on it, try to find something negative and then come back to me and tell me. I've done that with a lot of people and they've all been like, I can't find anything. I'm trying, but I can't find anything. And so I think that a lot of that is going to be pushed back in the beginning of the legislative season, but I really am confident that if we can do a good job at making this a normalized conversation and a legitimate conversation based on data, like you said, I don't know how people can't, but I've been I've been wrong before.
But we know people can't.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see. I really don't know. I'm certainly hopeful.
I just was thinking, overdose prevention site is something that, advice that somebody gave me.
Yep.
There's an article somewhere, and I can't remember, but there's a whole article about this. Why semantics matter in politics, or something like that.
Absolutely. It's such, I think even myself that consumption sounds better than injection, right? That's just it's unfortunate that you need to sort of make it sound better for people to not hate on it, but
yeah, it means that, it's like for those of you who are trying to get your information based on slogans and sound bites, here you go. Here's something soft for you. Maybe you'll buy it.
Exactly. You're, at the very least, you won't immediately be against it.
Yeah. So you said that there's already a bill. There's already something in the legislature.
Yeah.
And you are publishing, I don't remember now if we said this on camera or not.
Yeah.
You're publishing a report, not just you, but the coalition soon. And so how can people find out more about this issue? And when can they find that?
So the bill would be on the legislative page, and It was presented by Celine Colburn, from the representative from Burlington. The report, once I have it, I plan to do a press conference on the issue and release it to the media. I'll also put it on my own Facebook page, probably my Twitter account. Our office, unfortunately, doesn't have a website, but I'm a state employee, so my email is public, and if anybody wants a copy of it, I'm happy to do that.
Great.
And give it to people once we have it.
And I'll follow you closely, so if people miss that, then I'll be able to post it on my...
Great.
Sarah, George, I know you're busy, and I know you got a drive coming up, so the fact that you've made time to have this conversation, like you said, we could have talked about it for a lot longer, but I appreciate the time you gave me. Thank you very much.
No, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And folks, you can check out this podcast and literature underneath of it at blogtalkradio.com/youngjustice or find us on the Apple Podcast Store. I'll see you next time.